It was a dark and stormy night. Those were the first words of Snoopy's novel. He was sitting on top of his doghouse typing a story, and Snoopy always began his stories with, "It was a dark and stormy night." Well, Lucy happened to come along, and she put in her 2 cents worth of advice. "You brainless dog," she said, "that's the dumbest thing I've ever read. Who ever heard of such a silly way to begin a story? Don't you know that all good stories begin once upon a time?" She berates and belittles him more, and then Lucy left. The next frame shows Snoopy starting over his story. Once upon a time, it was a dark and stormy night. See, sooner or later, we all have to weather some dark and stormy nights. And the sweet singer of Israel understood this as well as anybody. And so in Psalm chapter 23, David takes the journey no one wants to take. He said in verse 4, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for God is with me." David spent time down in the valley of darkness, and we will too. Jesus said in John 16:33, "In this world you will have trouble." Even the most obedient sheep still has to spend time down in the darkness. In fact, here are 5 certainties about dark valleys. Fact number 1, dark valleys are inevitable. There's no escaping them. Either you've just come out of a dark valley, or you're in one right now, or you're headed toward one. James 1 and verse 2 says, "Consider it pure joy when you face dark valleys," or when you face trials and tribulations. Not if you face them, but when you face them, because they're bound to come. Dark valleys are inevitable. Fact number 2, dark valleys are unpredictable. Have you ever planned on having a flat tire or a car wreck? How about an injury or an illness, the loss of a job, or the loss of a loved one? These things usually catch us by surprise. And someone listening to me right now is going to get a phone call this week or next week or perhaps later this month that's going to jolt and jar your life. It could be from a doctor, might be from a family member, might be from your boss. But you're going to get some news that you did not expect and that you could not anticipate, because dark valleys are unpredictable. Fact number 3, dark valleys are impartial. They're no respecter of persons. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, educated or uneducated, male or female, Democrat or Republican, red, yellow, black or white. We all have to deal with valleys and shadows. Jesus said in Matthew 5:45 that God sends his rain on the righteous and the unrighteous alike. So dark, stormy nights are impartial, just like dark valleys. But here's the good news, and this is the 4th fact. Fact number 4, dark valleys are purposeful. God has a reason for taking us through the dark valleys, and David understood this. In the winter, he would take his sheep down to the lowlands where the pastures were greener and the temperature was warmer. And then in the summer, the weather would start to get hot, and he would move the sheep to the high ground. And the only way to get the sheep from the low ground to the high ground was to go through the valleys and the gorges that are common to Palestine. And one dangerous valley, the valley between Jerusalem and Jericho, the one we read about in Luke chapter 10, where the man was passing through and he was beaten by a band of robbers and left for dead, that valley was often referred to as the valley of the shadow of death. And it may have been this very valley that David was alluding to. It was a deep canyon with steep walls, a long, narrow gorge full of dangers lurking in the dark. And this may have been the one that David had in mind when he wrote this psalm, because shepherds took their sheep right through that valley on the way to the fields. It's the kind of place no sheep would ever want to go, because there's nowhere to run or hide from predators. Coyotes, bears, wolves take cover in these broken cliffs. And from their vantage point, they can easily prey on the sheep if the shepherd is not attentive and alert. And there's nowhere for the sheep to escape. There's no way out. And to make matters worse, it's dark and gloomy in there. The only time the sun hits the bottom of that valley is when it's directly overhead, and it's menacing and threatening. The valley is subject to sudden storms and flash floods that send walls of water rampaging down the slopes. And there can be avalanches, rock slides, mudslides, and other natural disasters that can injure or even destroy the sheep. But David said, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for God is with me. Sometimes God won't let you go around the valley. Sometimes the right path is right through it. And the purpose is always the same. It's to get the sheep to a better place. Now notice the shepherd is not a long distance guide. He enters the shadows with us. So in verse 4, there's a strategic change in language. Did you notice that? The pronouns change. In the first 3 verses, David says, he leads, he guides, he refreshes. But in verse 4, he says, you, God, are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. In other words, when David gets in the valley, he stops talking about God and he starts talking to God. And that's the effect that dark valleys tend to have on us. They draw us closer to God. And all of a sudden, the ultimate becomes the intimate. And we stand face to face with the shepherd of our souls. And when we finally leave the valley, that's when we realize we're closer to God than we were when we entered it. And we will leave the valley. I mean, that's the final thing we learn. Fact number 5, valleys are temporary. They're not permanent. They have an end. Now, oftentimes, valleys feel like a place of no escape, like a cave with no exit. But the truth is, valleys are like tunnels because they always have a beginning and an end. We pass through the dark tunnel and eventually we end up out on the other side and back into the light. And David knew that. He said, even though I walk through the dark valley, I will fear no evil. Why, David? Because I know the shepherd is eventually going to bring me out safe and sound on the other side. So don't equate darkness with distance. When the hour is the very darkest, God is the very closest. Now, I'm no science major, but I know this much about shadows. You can't have a shadow unless you have a light, right? And the light is the Lord himself. And his light is so bright that even the darkest shadow can't snuff it out. It's a question. What is the darkest valley of all? It's the shadow that's hanging over all of us, and that's death. Death is waiting for all of us, but Jesus has been through that valley, and so when he leads us through that valley, he isn't taking us anywhere that he hasn't already been. He knows what's ahead, and it changes the way we view our valleys. And we still have to face darkness, but we don't have to fear it. We can keep walking by faith because we know that we're headed to a better place. And the shepherd has promised to get us there. And he's promised to comfort us along the way. And that's why David could walk through the dark valley. He didn't run through it or hurry in haste or panic. He walked through the valley. Why? Because God was with him, comforting him with his rod and his staff. You see, those were the protective tools that the shepherd used to guard his sheep and to keep them safe. The rod was a 2-foot club-like weapon that was usually cut from the knot of a tree because the rod always had a big knob at the end of it. Nails and bits of sharp metals were embedded in the end of that knob or that club, and the shepherd could throw that club like a missile to defend the sheep. The staff, also known as the shepherd's crook, was a long wooden pole with a hook-like curve at the end of it. And the shepherd would use that staff to guide the sheep along the path and to rescue them from a pit or a thorn bush and to pull them close to his side. Isn't that a comforting thought? It's comforting to me, especially during those times when I stray from the place I need to be. Your rod and your staff, They comfort me. They give me the confidence and the courage I need to weather the dark and stormy nights. Psalm 23 doesn't promise the absence of shadows. It promises the continuing presence of the shepherd. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for the shepherd is with me. Fear wasn't a factor for David, and it doesn't have to be a factor for you if the Lord is your shepherd. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.